Marvel Snap's newest card, Jim Hammond, is interesting, but ultimately I think I'm going to have to call him Jim Scammond. Now, I don't envy the design team for the position they put themselves in when making a card like this, because this card has a couple of interesting ingredients that you really don't want to overtune. You don't want to make a card that scales too heavily with gaining extra energy, because that's rewarding people for doing something they already want to be doing, which can be a little bit problematic. We've seen that be problematic in previous metagames, and even in this one, without Shang-Chi around, we're seeing people be rewarded for playing a bunch of 10s by getting to play a bunch of extra stuff that also does cost less because of that. Cough, cough, scar. So we've seen that when you reward people for doing something they already really want to be doing, it can be an awkward spot for a new card, because when you miss high on them, like they did with Surtur when Surtur came out, it becomes kind of the only really good thing to do. The good news for Jim Hammond is he definitely didn't miss high, and I think a lot of that is down to him being a one-drop, which is another awkward part of what this means for his design. Because I think one thing we've learned about one-drops is even though they can scale in meaningful ways, they're very rarely worth building around because their scaling is usually capped. You look at something like a Mad Thinker, you look at something like a Jim Hammond, there is a limited amount of power you can reasonably put on him. And so when you build around him, you build around getting a 1/6. And a 1/6 or so is not really what's going to make the difference. So simultaneously, this is a card that is asking you to build around him because he doesn't really work if you don't build around him, but also not paying you off enough for building around him, which ties back into the fact that he is a card that is meant to be a complementary piece in a deck that already wants to gain a lot of extra energy. And when you are a complementary piece in a deck that wants to gain a lot of extra energy, the problem you end up having is when you gain that extra energy, you want to be doing different things. You want to be playing bigger stuff. If I'm going to have 13 energy on the final turn of the game, it's great that I get some of that for free to go on to my Jim Hammond, but also I'm probably winning the game anyway, so when I'm doing awesome stuff with my Jim Hammond, he's overkill, and when I'm not doing awesome stuff with my Jim Hammond, he's not worth putting in my deck. And I think largely that's the dynamic that you're going to run into a lot when we talk about Jim Hammond as a card specifically. Now, I also think that he has an interesting release timing. He was released in a metagame where Killmonger is not around, Shang-Chi is not around, and Shadow King is not around. And these are cards that meaningfully impact him. Killmonger and Shadow King more literally, and Shang-Chi largely because when you have a bunch of energy, you end up playing a bunch of big guys. Shang-Chi is typically good against strategies that are relying on that, as we'll see from what we're going to be talking about in the deck section. So this is actually kind of a high watermark for him to be released in, and the fact that he's not incredibly impressive to me does mark that as like a, oh man, this is like supposedly a good metagame for him. Some of the decks that I'm showing you are probably not going to be playable if and when they revert those changes, and that means that you are in a very awkward spot if you're purchasing him, because you're purchasing him expecting him to be at least this good, but he probably won't be when those cards are back around. I think Killmonger especially is kind of the kiss of death here. It is simply just a lot to ask for you to be a Jim Hammond deck like this. There's really only one deck that is going to meaningfully be able to be a Jim Hammond deck and also play Kyera, and that is some form of She-Hulk Fallen One deck, which there is a version of that right now, but it's just kind of okay now, and it's going to get worse when those cards come back. And I think that that is largely where I'm at on Jim Hammond. I find it hard to believe that Jim Hammond will be the best use of the resources the game provides you. This list was cooked up by Splat and disseminated pretty widely. Now, Splat is a very good deck builder when it comes to dealing with stuff that's a little bit off kilter. If I wanted a Symbiote Spider-Man deck list, he would be one of the first people that I've asked. I also think that this deck list is gaining a lot from being in the metagame that it's in. we actually are in a metagame where a bunch of people are just messing around with Kang stuff. They're trying to figure out if any of that stuff is playable. I felt like a lot of the Jim Hammond decks I was playing were only viable because people were still experimenting with new Kang, and I think new Kang is probably driving up the win rate of a deck like this fairly significantly, and that context should probably be understood when you go look at stats for this, because I believe the untapped stats for this deck are quite good, and I did pretty well with it, but it also felt like a lot of what I was doing was playing against dinky mid-range decks that were doing like Kang and Quinjet type stuff, and then I would just have more points than them because they were doing dinky Kang and Quinjet type stuff. It's sort of like when Kid Omega came out and I was like, oh my God, this is insane. I'm beating up everybody. But what was actually happening in hindsight was like, oh, you know, there's a lot of people playing Nightmare stuff and they just simply can't do anything about this. And so I don't want to make the same mistake again and say that I did well with this in a specific context. Therefore, that will be generalizable across multiple contexts, because I think that largely this is the kind of thing that is not gonna hold up very well. And I think it's holding up in a very specific context of everyone playing a bunch of very medium mid-range decks that have all had their interactive cards nerfed. So effectively, it's a bunch of people playing mid-range decks with proactive tech cards, none of which meaningfully impact us except for Mobius. Mobius, by the way, does absolutely destroy you. And so if you are playing this deck and you see like the Invisible Woman deck, you should know that there is a Mobius in there, and you are going to feel really sad if you start skipping for the She-Hulk. But generally speaking, this deck actually, in this metagame, is a lot more viable than you would think. I would look at this normally and say, absolutely unplayable. I don't want to be a Magic deck. I don't want to be a deck that loses to Mobius. And those weaknesses are prominent. But if those are the only real weaknesses and you are going over the top of everything else, you can do some real damage with a deck like this. Largely, the thing that stuck out to me the absolute most was that I wasn't able to get as much use out of Taskmaster as I would like. I really feel like this deck just needs one really other big six to copy, and that card just doesn't really exist right now. A lot of people were using their energy fairly efficiently. And so I do think that there is that kind of thing where like Red Hulk is pretty small and my Taskmaster is copying like some reasonably sized stuff. The Shuri stuff is cool. And you are going to have like a lot of fear related snaps where like you're able to do Shuri into Symbiote Spider-Man. The Symbiote Spider-Man reactivates the Shuri and then you get 10 energy out of the fallen one. And that kind of stuff is awesome, right? Like you can do a lot of cool stuff. But there are some pretty pronounced weaknesses, not just the stuff like Mobius and getting rid of the magic location with either a Legion or a Merlin. There's also stuff like Negasonic, blowing up your thing in your Shuri lane. That can usually be pretty bad. The fact that your final turns are pretty heavy means that if you're not ramping out Fallen One or alternatively playing a Magic, you often aren't going to be putting enough points on the board. But if you are able to do those things, it is quite solid. And Jim Hammond, like I had some games where Jim Hammond was a pretty big dude, but I'm not sure I had many games where Jim Hammond being a pretty big dude was all that relevant to whether I was going to win or lose, because a lot of the time when he's a pretty big dude, I'm winning anyway. Derek has been sort of living in the Silver Surfer First Steps, Gwenpool, Kitty Pryde land for a while now, and this is what I got that's in that vein, and it's not bad by any means, but I think largely the thing that happens to me when I play like Jim Hammond decks that are like this is I sort of sit there and ask myself why I'm not playing an Invisible Woman First Steps deck, and I don't really think I have a good answer. Until we get like potentially data mine cards like Zombie Scarlet Witch and things of that nature, I just don't know if investing in Kitty Pryde is going to be worth it. And I think that's actually largely the issue this deck runs into. Like, it is nice that it gets Jim Hammond, but also this deck has some sort of fundamental positioning issues with how the metagame is right now. And it also has a pretty massive amount of 12 card syndrome, which for those who are unaware, very similar to Pokemon's 4-slot syndrome. There's just a lot of really good cards that you want to run in here, and you do end up losing out by not being able to include all of them because you have to make very tough choices. And I think that largely the end product is a deck that if you had the exact perfect 12 cards would be like 51%, but because you probably don't have the exact perfect 12 cards is going to end up being like 48 or 47. And that makes me feel sad because I love playing Kitty Pryde decks, and I would love to be able to come to you and say, we actually have a good Kitty Pryde deck. It's been forever. I just don't think we've hit that point yet. It's just a little little bit subpar compared to the other points and tech decks. And when you look at like how clean the Invisible Woman First Step shell is, with the ability to interact not just with Mobius and Stardust, but also to have a reasonable amount of points of power on the board, to have a sort of out to confusing stuff in the form of Thing First Steps, just a lot of big bodies at the small end of the curve, a 1/5, a 1/4, things like that. It just sort of feels like this is secondary unless you are doing something really stupid. And if you pull off the Gwenpool stuff, it can be awesome. The Iron Man can be super awesome. But a lot of the time, this deck is doing things that are cool and nice and good, but just end up being a little bit smaller or less impactful than the good stuff decks that the good stuff strategies that other decks are able to put forward, right? This one was put together by Fox, and he ended up deleting it because he didn't believe in it before he even played. I don't even know if he owns Jim Hammond, but it was theory crafted by him, and I played a pretty decent amount of this, and it didn't feel actively bad. But again, I think a lot of that is down to the context in which I was playing it, right? A lot of these decks, I think, don't necessarily have the beef to compete consistently. One thing that really struck me about this deck was if you get bad draws, you are just sort of instantly losing the game. Your bad draws really compound. Your bad openers really compound strongly in a deck like this. Like if the first card you play is on turn 3, you basically instantly lose because all of the things you want to do are things that snowball outwards from your earlier plays or things you are allowed to do because you made those plays early. So like once you hit the point of playing a 3-drop on 3 being your first play of the game, you never actually get the ability to weave in your ones without having to sacrifice your development of some other things later. When this deck draws well, I think it can compete with basically anything. If you have like a Jim Hammond on 1 and a Merlin and a Werewolf, and then you start doing Bolts of Balthak, oh yeah, I should explain why Jim Hammond is in here. He's here for Bolts of Balthak. Like the idea here is basically just we have a lot of ability to draw stuff out of our deck. We're getting bolts out of that pretty consistently. We are going to be able to get Bolts of Balthak for extra energy for Jim Hammond. We have Merlin's Once in Future for extra energy for Jim Hammond. And that is enough to make him worth running in the deck. A 1/4 off a Once in Future or a larger card off of a Bolts of Balthak, a 1/6. You can end up doing some pretty strong stuff here. I think the best Jim Hammond game I had was one where I had him as a 1/10 in the location that gives -2 to stuff. So he's actually a 1/12 and then cloned him with the Agamotto spell. That was the best Jim Hammond was for me. And that is nothing to sneeze at. It's just, it's also not like the thing that's making this deck function. He is a cool card. He is doing cool stuff some of the time. And it's nice to have him in here. And I don't want to act like it's not. But I'm also not convinced that playing a deck like this is a compelling reason for him to be in here. And I'm also not even convinced that, say, something like a Kang wouldn't be a better card in the aggregate. Because the fundamental thing about Jim Hammond being a 1-drop is that it just doesn't have a lot of impact unless you get the exact right things to happen. That's how a 1-drop has to be balanced. So it's possible that the raw upside of a Kang might just be a better option in a deck like this. I'm not going to say this is the greatest idea of all time, but Jim Hammond does deserve some consideration in a Wiccan deck. Unfortunately, I think the issue you run into is if you are going to play Jim Hammond in a Wiccan deck, you have to figure out what the rest of the deck looks like. And I am willing to believe that 4 1s is enough for you to feel pretty decent about it. The problem is that when you run 4 1s, which I do think is what's required if you're going to play a non-Quicksilver Wiccan deck, you end up having to run Domino in order to be able to run the rest of the cards in your deck. Otherwise, you'd end up having to run like 4 1s and like 3 2s, maybe 4 2s as well, and you just wouldn't really have any cards that actually meaningfully do something. So you end up making the same sacrifice as the Quicksilver people, but 1s are generally worse than 2s. A lot of why the Quicksilver stuff works is just how strong a lot of 2s can be, how helpful they can be to your future curves. Stuff like Merlin and Kate Bishop make it a lot easier to get to the Wiccan. And so you end up with a deck that, while I do think it is a fairly interesting deck building exercise, I largely think is also going to run into fundamental issues that make it inferior to other Wiccan decks. Even though the Jim Hammond stuff is cool and this is a good way of building around Jim Hammond, I don't expect this kind of stuff to have longevity or be a meaningful part of a developed metagame. It's hard to talk about Arishem because there's so much going on, right? Like you could play 37 card Monty, you can mix and match the amount of stuff that goes in your deck. People are playing a decent amount of big decks now that Kang has come out, which makes this deck a little bit worse because people are going to be playing Cassandra Nova. I've definitely run into plenty of people doing like PF Nova stuff just to beat up on all the people doing Kang stuff because Nova is just a little bit better now than she previously was. The thing about Jim Hammond and Arishem is he is effectively a 1/6 if you play him anytime on turn 1 or turn 2. That's pretty good. You get bonus energy. I like having a 1/6 in my Arishem deck. The problem is Arishem has to build itself in such a way that all of the cards in the deck are high impact, right? And I think Jim Hammond is not high impact enough, especially if you're drawing him later. I'm not saying it's a bad idea to put him in your Arishem deck. I'm just not saying it's a good enough idea that you have to go out and get Jim Hammond if you want to play Arishem. And I think you're going to run into that kind of sentiment a lot with this guy. So my final verdict on Jim Hammond is he is largely not going to contribute to winning games in a meaningful way in the deck building stage right now. And I think that's probably bad. Like you can play this kind of stuff, but I think it reveals sort of a fundamental issue with 1-drops and how they make 1-drops and what they're allowed to do with 1-cost cards, because you cannot put a big game-winning effect on a 1-cost. But if you put a small effect on a 1-cost and it is able to snowball, it can be a very damaging thing for the card to end up costing 1. So I think they end up in a spot where they don't want to make a Jim Hammond too strong, in much the same way as Clea, where like if that is too strong, wow, that's problematic. But you also want to make it interesting and dynamic. And for what it's worth, I think Clea did this a little bit better. Jim Hammond is just hard to fit into decks that get extra energy because his fundamental impact is so low. And when you have extra energy, it's only really real if you convert it into playing bigger things than you would otherwise be able to do. So the level 1 thing is that if you're an extra energy deck, you don't actually want to play Jim Hammond. You want to play something bigger so that you can use that extra energy more efficiently, and that is going to be a better use of the deck slot than Jim Hammond is. And I think ultimately that is the contradiction that dooms Jim Hammond to a life of mediocrity unless something changes. As always, I have been KMBest, you have been phenomenal, and my life of mediocrity continues every single day. Remember to like and subscribe, especially if you got this far in the video, and I will see you in the next one.